This acrylic painting tutorial will show you how to paint a piece of pumpkin pie using only the primary colors, red, yellow, blue, and white. Any brand of acrylic paint will work, just make sure they're your basic primary colors, and you need a canvas or paper to paint on. I'm just using a cheap piece of watercolor paper I had in my classroom. You need a variety of brushes, a paint palette, and a cup of water to clean your brush. If you love learning about art, support this public school teacher side hustle and subscribe. On my palette, I have red, yellow, blue, and white spread out so that I can mix my colors. I have a paper towel and I'm just using a pointy brush to mix my neutral tan pie color. So I'm thinking the color of the crust. I'm gonna mix red and blue, and that makes purple. So there's a couple ways to think about this. You can mix your complementary colors, or you can mix all three primary colors together to make a nice brown. So yellow and purple are complementary colors. So I am mixing all three together, but you can also simplify and you can mix with your complements if you have a pre-made purple. Keep in mind the colors are gonna change based on the brand of paint you're using and based on the exact color pigment that's in each paint. This is fire red, it is ultramarine blue, and then just yellow. And this is the Blick acrylic paints that I use in my classroom. You can see that I am mixing and it's making kind of a nice dark brown. I don't want the crust to look burnt, so I will be adding white. But basically what you need to do is if it looks too red, counterbalance that with either blue or yellow. If it looks too green, add red and kind of test it out from there. This is not the most beautiful color, but it certainly works if we are painting food, especially the pie crust. So I wanted it to be a little bit darker and a little bit less yellow, so I'm bringing in that red and that blue to give it more of a purple vibe. It's a little too purple, so I'm adding yellow. And again, play around, and if you're using the exact colors I'm using, you can copy it exactly. But really, you need to do some test swatches first because your brand of paint might work very differently than the brand that I'm using. You can see this has a darker feel, and it has more of a mahogany or more of a purplish brown. I'm gonna take white and make a tint is a base color mixed with white. This is where it's gonna really start to look delicious and pie-like. You can also use this same technique to mix a variety of skin tones. So this is a really nice light, and then I can mix a little bit more of my base brown that I made, make it a little bit darker. So basically a value scale. You can always clean your brush, but since I'm using a very limited color palette, I'm just dipping straight in. And then you can use the straight up base color like I did before or mix it slightly for a darker brown. Most of my pie is pumpkin, so you're gonna see more orange than anything else, but the crust has lots of shadows and highlights that I want a variety, at least 3 values of my crust color. Now I'm going to sketch my pie. I Googled pumpkin pie, and I'm picking one that has whipped cream on top and a really good side view. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a slice of pie right in front of me? That's the way I'd love to do this, from direct observation. But if you're teaching in a classroom or you're learning how to paint, sometimes that can be overwhelming. And so using photography is not a problem. Just make sure that at some point in your artistic journey that you are painting from direct observation. Painting from a photograph certainly is great for learning, and it has its pros and cons. So I'm just kind of getting the generic shape. I'm just using a mechanical pencil, and I'm paying attention to the top of the pie, the side, the crust, and making sure it looks 3-dimensional. Practice makes better, and so I'm going to make my crust a little bit thicker at the bottom and on the side, which is where I'm going to use that really light value that I created for the crust. I definitely want to add some whipped cream on top, not only because it's delicious, but because the white really looks nice against the orange. Now I'm going to paint the crust color first, since you can see that I've mixed a whole bunch. Remember, I'm doing a brown that I made using red, yellow, and blue, and then I add white to create a tint or a lighter version of brown, which will come across a tan crust color. For now, I'm just going to paint the crust all the same value, so just that kind of medium tan, and then I'll go back in with highlights and lowlights and shadows to make the crust look more dynamic. You could keep it really simple, but I like to do a layer of a base color and then kind of go in with more detail. The best example of this will be in the top crust because it kind of juts out of the pie, and so you'll have some areas that in the oven kind of get a little bit darker, and then you'll have some areas with the curve of the crust that have a highlight. So I kind of did my base color. It looks a little bit darker, and I'm gonna add some white to do the highlights first. So I am looking at a photograph. Make sure that you are looking at a reference image as you're painting, and I love a good old-fashioned crust with that really nice wave to it. So I'm painting the highlight in a curved fashion to give it that depth I'm looking for. I'm gonna add a little bit more white here, and this part of the crust has a highlight as well because, as you know, with pie, it gets darker where it's touching a surface or where the heat is getting it from the top of the oven, and closer to the actual pumpkin part doesn't cook quite as much, and so it's lighter in color. Just this lighter highlight here gives it more depth, and it already looks like pie even though I'm using basically one color. I want to bump up the contrast in the top of the crust, so I'm adding an even more lighter highlight there and on the edge of the pie. Now I'm going to use the darkest version of my brown to create a shadow in the area that I want it to look a little bit darker. Now I don't want my crust to look burnt, but you can see this warmer, darker brown or tan really gives it a dynamic look. Look at the photograph or the piece of pie that you are painting and find those darkest areas. I find mine mostly where the crust is touching the pumpkin, kind of going in on the curve. I am happy with this for now. So with a clean brush, I'm going to mix my pumpkin pie orange. So hopefully you have been taught your primary colors and how to blend and mix for your secondary colors. Yellow and red make orange, and this is going to be leaning more towards a yellow orange. So yellow is a little bit of a less dominant color. So I'm testing it out here, and I do think it looks very pumpkin-like, that kind of beautiful, natural looking yellow orange. So I'm gonna fill in the side view of the pie because that's gonna be lighter because it's inside the pie and the oven doesn't touch it. So the top gets a little bit darker. I love how smooth pumpkin pie is. This yellow orange is really beautiful. Pumpkin pie is just such a great pie visually, and it's delicious. And so I'm very happy that I got this right the first time. I think the top is gonna be a little bit more challenging. I need to add a little bit more red to this, but I want it to still be more yellow orange. And it's not like a bright neon orange. So I'm gonna put a little bit of that brown that I mixed to kind of tone it down a little bit and make it more of a neutral and not so like bright. That looks warmer and it looks darker and more red, so I'm gonna try it out. And that looks pretty good. So I think what I'll do is paint that a light layer. And then there's more depth in my color on the top of the pie. There are some light areas and some dark areas that the side really doesn't have in the photograph that I'm looking at. So I'm just gonna go ahead and paint the whole top surface, and then I'll go in and create a little bit more variety of color. Now, could you keep it simple and just paint this plane of the pie, the top one solid color? Sure, but when I paint, I really love to play around with shadow and light and create those nuances of color that are so fun to paint. Speaking of shadows, I'm gonna add a little bit of brown. So I'm taking a little bit of that purple that I mixed the first time when I was mixing my original brown, and I'm gonna create a nice little shadow that's underneath my whipped cream. So again, pay attention to the photograph you're using and look for those light and dark areas. I like how brown it looks. I think it really matches the vibe of the pie, and this will make the whipped cream look like it's not just floating in space, but really sitting on top of the pie. I also noticed there's some darker areas where the pie meets the crust, so I'm gonna go back in and key those to be a little bit darker. I'm gonna move on to the background. I never wanna save the background for last because I wanna have color harmony. And I'm gonna use my ultramarine blue mixed with my dirty white. You can see that I didn't do a good job cleaning my brush. What I like about this is it grays out my blue, and instead of just a blue background, it kind of ties in the colors that I used for my pie. There's a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, a little bit of blue, and so it makes a really harmonious color scheme. It's probably a good idea to pour more white so I'm not using, I don't want my color scheme to be muddy, but luckily my colors are so limited with this primary color palette that you really can't go wrong because I use all the other colors to create my oranges and tans. My goal here is to create kind of a halo effect around the pie as if it's like, ah, and there's light coming from the top and then a shadow at the bottom. There's a little bit of yellow on my brush here, but again, I really think it ties into the orange of the pie, and it's gonna dry, and I'll go over it one more time with a layer. So you can see my white is still kind of providing that kind of dirty gray, which I really like. I love a neutral, I love a gray. It's one of my favorite colors to paint with, and so I like that it's kind of trending a little bit more gray than just blue. I'm using more base blue underneath the pie. Now it still has that white mixed in it, so it's kind of grayed out, but I want there to be a shadow. This is not a painting that's super realistic as far as like the atmosphere that the pie is in. It's a pretty neutral background. I'm not painting a plate or like a scene behind it in a bakery or at a birthday party or Thanksgiving dinner. It's a celebration of pie. It's like a pie portrait. And so I do want to give it some atmosphere. I don't want it to look like it's floating in space. I want it to have some like anchoring to a mysterious surface, but I don't want to paint something realistic. So that is why I'm doing a darker bottom, as if the pie is sitting on some mysterious surface, and then it fades to light as it goes behind. Now, you could paint a pattern in the background, you could do textures, there's so many things you can do. I'm keeping mine simple because it's more about the color theory practice of mixing your colors with a limited palette of just your primary colors and white. I'm using a technique, and by the way, I did speed things up, so if you're wondering, wow, she's painting super fast, this is double time. And I am mixing wet on wet. So what I mean by that is I'm painting directly on the paper, mixing my colors there before they dry. That's a really fun way to paint. It can be tricky because things dry at different rates, but I just love how it blends, and you can always go back in and amp up your darks and lights as needed. Now that the top portion has dried a little bit, I'm gonna go back with that white and try and lighten it up, directly painting and blending with the paint that's there. A good trick is to use one brush to apply the paint and a second brush that's clean and slightly wet, like mostly dry, but a little bit of water on your brush to blend it. Takes a little bit of practice, but the technique is really fun. It is whipped cream time, and I'm taking a giant glob of pure white paint. So you can see right there that I did pour more because I want this to be pure white, and I'm applying it very thick. So think about food and texture. You're trying to recreate what the texture actually looks like. So I'm putting a heavy amount of paint, and yes, it's gonna take a while to dry to really get that thick layered effect. Then what I'm doing now is I'm mixing a little bit of that neutral kind of grayish blue to add a very slight shadow. Yes, whipped cream is white, but you want to pay attention to the areas of light and dark as well. And this really connects the whipped cream to the background because you're borrowing some of the same colors to create a little bit more dynamic shadows in the whipped cream. You can always go back in and add a little bit more, and I love painting with this thick paint to make it look so realistic. An artist to study would be Wayne Thiebaud. He's probably the most famous artist or painter that has food as their subject matter. And also artist Sarah Zinn. She has some amazing watercolor food illustrations that are so lifelike with their texture, it was gonna trick you that it's the real thing. I'll put links to those artists' websites and examples in my description box. I'm going to add a little bit more of that darker blue shadow to give it more depth, not only at the bottom where it's touching the pie, but also kind of in the center. And again, look at an image while doing this. You definitely don't want this to turn into the poop emoji. Luckily though, it's white, so the color will help you with that. And I'm again using just that same grayish blue that I mixed in my background. I am using a clean white though, because I want the white of the whipped cream on top to be an emphasized area that really pops when you look at it. Now that my background's somewhat dry, I'm gonna go in with that pure blue and really get a nice shadow. So I'm gonna kind of paint it in a straight line with my flat brush, and then I'm gonna spread it out so it fades into the darker part of the background. So I'm putting kind of some diagonal brush strokes. You can see on the left-hand side the paint isn't quite dry, and so it makes a weird texture. I'm just gonna go back over that with a little bit more paint. It happens, that's acrylic paint for you. And it depends on the brand. This is not a heavy body acrylic, so it's a little thin, a little watery. It's really good for beginning artists and for teachers because it's just the best bang for your buck. Depending on the brand that you get and the color, every brand has a different blue and each blue will interact differently. So play around, and there's nothing wrong with using cheap materials. I think sometimes we feel like art supplies have to be super expensive. Does it make a difference? Yes, sometimes, but it's not like you can't make beautiful art with inexpensive or readily accessible materials. And actually the color I'm using here, I added a little bit of red. So there's that dark purple that I used to make my original brown. So if you're wondering like, wait, that doesn't look blue. Yes, I did mix a little bit of that red to get a purple because I want to punch up my background a little bit and also make it darker underneath the pie. Now that the bottom has a little more depth and shadows to it, I'm gonna bump the contrast even more, and I'm gonna mix that white that's a little newer with that kind of blue color that I think has a little bit of violet in it. And so you can see that the white is much more dominant because that has dried out quite a bit, and I'm just taking my brush and fanning it in a circular motion to blend that white into the pre-existing paint. Oops, got a little bit of brown on my brush, but it's harmonious. I'm just gonna kind of take some more white and just overlap it. That's the beauty of acrylic paint, is you can layer, 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 and layer until you get it right. I'm mixing a little bit more of that violet purple color. What I really like about it is it's looking very gray. And again, I just think gray is such a great choice. It's certainly blue, it certainly is a cool color, but that gray kind of neutral is one of my favorite things. I'm going to do a little bit more work in the pie, and I'm taking that same brown that I mixed with red, yellow, and blue. It probably has a little bit of white in it. And I'm just asking myself when looking at the photograph, where are the darkest areas of the actual pumpkin part of the pie? So where the crust is on that top left-hand side, also down at the bottom where the crust is touching, where it's touching the pie filling. I'm going to speed things up here, and what I'm doing at the top is, even though that's the darkest part of the pie, there is a shiny highlight, and so I'm just adding that lighter value and then using my finger to blend it in there. I want it to look like a highlight, but let it also still be the darkest part of the pie. My goal was to keep this very simple, so although I could work and rework all the details, I think I'm going to call this finished. So I had taped down my artwork to a piece of paper so I could paint freely to the edges, and also so the paper wouldn't move around while I'm filming. So I'm going to remove that and cut those edges so the white strip isn't there, and she's all done. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me, and if you're interested in more tutorials, check these out. Find my website, thatartteacher.com, for full-length lesson plans and student examples, and my Instagram is thatartteacher_Machado to see what my students are currently up to in my classes.